On the 42nd floor of Ashford Tower, the office lay submerged in darkness. Only the lights of Atlantic City spilled in through the immense glass wall, while the flickering glow from hundreds of casinos far below shimmered like a miniature galaxy spread across the earth. Everything inside the room was dressed in black and deep brown, from the Italian leather sofa to the oil paintings worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Every detail seemed to breathe the same two words: power and control. Yet on the gleaming black walnut desk, amid stacks of investment contracts and confidential files, there was one thing that did not belong: a crumpled sheet of drawing paper, the cheap kind elementary school children often use. The wax crayon strokes were uneven and clumsy, with color bleeding past the lines in places. The picture showed three people standing beneath a brilliant yellow sun. The woman in the middle had pure white wings like an angel. Beside her stood a little girl with curly hair, holding a red balloon. And the third figure, a man in a black suit, had a face colored over again and again until the crayon wax had built up thick on the page, as though the child who made this drawing had poured a special devotion into that one person alone. In the right corner of the paper was a carefully written note, the handwriting still awkward but every letter plainly formed. Uncle Grant no longer stands in the darkness. A hand lifted the drawing. It was a man's hand, long-fingered, with a platinum signet ring on the ring finger engraved with a stylized letter A. Grant Ashford, 33 years old, the man before whom the entire East Coast underworld bowed its head, sat perfectly still before the drawing of a child. His eyes, the same eyes that had once made drug lords tremble and corrupt politicians fall to their knees, now held something difficult to name. It was not emotion. Grant Ashford did not feel emotion, but it was helplessness, a sensation he had believed buried 24 years earlier, when he had been a shivering 9-year-old child huddled in the corner of a dark room. This was a man who had once picked up a telephone and destroyed an entire corporation within 48 hours. A man who had forced a United States senator to resign simply for daring to look at him the wrong way. No one in this city could endure his gaze for more than 3 seconds, and yet a rough, childish drawing by a 7-year-old girl had left him sitting here, alone in the dark, for more than an hour. Who was the child who had drawn this picture? Why would a kingpin like Grant Ashford appear in the family portrait of a little girl? And who was the woman with angel wings? To understand the story hidden behind this drawing, we must turn back 6 months in time. Back to a night of merciless rain in Atlantic City, when a 27-year-old widow risked everything to break into this 42-story tower. She carried no weapon. She had no ally. All she possessed was hatred, and a single question that had haunted her for 2 years. Who killed her husband? 6 months earlier, rain lashed against the windows of Ashford Tower as though it meant to rip the entire building apart. If you want to know what happens next, please press like and share this video to support our channel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you will not miss the next dramatic stories. Ashford Tower rose stark and unyielding through the curtain of night rain, its 42 stories of black glass, catching each flash of lightning like a colossal tombstone raised for anyone reckless enough to challenge the man who owned it. Rainwater streamed across the surface in long twisting trails, like tears running down the face of the building itself. At the rear entrance, the one reserved for janitorial and maintenance staff, a woman in a hood stood before the keycard scanner. Blair Kingston, 27 years old, looked thinner than the photograph on the counterfeit employee badge in her hand. 3 months of working the night shift in this place had laid a permanent veil of exhaustion over her brown eyes. Yet beneath that fatigue, a slow-burning fire still lived, one that had never gone out. She swiped the card. A green light blinked. The door opened with a soft click. Her heart began to beat faster, but her steps remained calm, the same as every other night. She pushed her cleaning cart into the elevator and pressed the button for the 38th floor. The elevator glided upward in silence, accompanied only by the faint hum of the motor. The 38th floor, the confidential records wing, a place where an ordinary janitor would have no reason to set foot. But Blair was no ordinary janitor. The elevator doors slid open, and the dark hallway flared suddenly to life as the motion sensors caught her movement. Blair held her breath and counted silently in her mind. 1, 2, 3. The security camera in the left corner had just completed a full sweep. She had 90 seconds before it scanned this area again. 90 seconds she had memorized over the course of 3 months, counting them over and over hundreds of times, until they had become as natural to her as a second heartbeat. 2 years. For 2 years, she had lived with this obsession. For 2 years, she had raised her 7-year-old daughter while following every broken scrap of evidence she could find. For 2 years, she had stayed awake through endless nights, studying every number, every name, every tiny fragment, and all of it had led her here, to this tower, to the records room at the end of the corridor. The memory of that fatal night remained as sharp as the blade of a knife buried in her heart. 3 in the morning, the shrill ring of the telephone tearing her out of sleep. The police officer's voice was flat and practiced, as though he were reading from a script prepared long before the call was ever made. Her husband's car had lost control on the mountain pass and plunged into a ravine 1,000 feet deep. His body had been found the following morning. They called it an accident. But Blair knew the truth couldn't be so simple, because only 2 hours before he died, Jason had called her. His voice was trembling, his breathing ragged, like a man fleeing from something closing in behind him. He told her he had found it, found proof of a vast money laundering operation, and the name he managed to say before the line was suddenly cut was Ashford Holdings. It was the last time she ever heard her husband's voice. Blair stopped outside the records room and swiped the senior staff keycard she had spent 6 weeks copying. The door opened. Inside stood rows upon rows of filing cabinets, reaching all the way to the ceiling, arranged in narrow aisles like a maze. Her eyes moved quickly over the labels, searching for the name that had haunted her for 730 days. Kingston. Jason. Personnel file. Closed. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled open the drawer. The thick file was there, as though it had been waiting for her for the past 2 years. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, the entire room burst into light. The overhead fixtures came on all at once, so bright that she had to narrow her eyes. Behind her, the door opened. Slow footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Then a voice broke the silence, deep and cold, like steel left in ice water. "Have you found what you came for, Mrs. Kingston?" Blair spun around, still clutching the file in her hand. In the doorway stood a tall man in a black 3-piece suit, one hand in his pocket, his posture so relaxed it was as if he were standing in his own living room. His eyes held her without blinking, the gaze of a predator studying prey already caught in the trap. Grant Ashford, the most powerful kingpin on the East Coast. The man she believed without a doubt had ordered her husband's death, and now he stood less than 10 steps away, blocking the only way out. Grant Ashford stepped into the records room with slow, measured strides, the soles of his leather shoes striking the marble floor and echoing through the stillness like the ticking of a fateful countdown. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Every footfall carried the absolute confidence of a man who held life and death in his hands. He was not in a hurry. He showed no trace of anxiety, no hint of anger. He simply moved toward Blair with the calm poise of a panther savoring the moment before it sprang. Blair retreated 1 step at a time, until her back met the cold metal filing cabinet behind her. There was nowhere left to go. She tightened her grip on the file until her knuckles turned white. But she did not tremble, did not beg, did not lower her eyes. Her brown gaze met the gray eyes of the man she believed had ordered her husband's murder, and in that look lived 2 years of hatred, 2 years of grief, and 2 years of waiting for this very moment. Grant stopped about 6 feet from her and tilted his head, studying her as though she were some fascinating work of art. Then he spoke, his voice deep and so steady it was almost terrifying. 93 days. You have been playing the role of a janitor in this building for 93 days. Did you truly think I knew nothing? Blair said nothing. Her jaw clenched so hard that the muscle at her temple began to twitch. Grant went on, and there was something in his tone that sounded almost like amusement. You are Blair Kingston, Jason Kingston's widow, my regional chief accountant's widow, the woman who has filed 17 lawsuits in district court, state court, and even with the Department of Justice, accusing my company over the past 2 years. 17 times, and all 17 were dismissed for lack of evidence. Blair felt her blood begin to boil, but she forced herself to remain still. When she spoke, her voice was cold and hard as steel. If you knew who I was from the beginning, why did you let me come this far? Why didn't you call the police? Grant smiled, a smile that never reached his eyes. Because I was curious. I wanted to see how far you could go. I wanted to know what you were truly looking for. And more than that, I wanted to see what you would do once you found it. Without warning, Blair hurled the file at him, and the papers burst apart in the air, scattering around the room. Is this what you wanted to hide? Proof that you ordered my husband killed? Grant did not even try to dodge. He let the pages drift down around his feet. Then he bent, picked up a few of them, glanced over the contents, and held them out toward Blair, his voice unnervingly calm. "You have not even read what you found." Blair snatched the page from his hand, her eyes racing across the words, then stopping all at once. This was not evidence of a murder plot. It was a promotion proposal. Jason Kingston had been recommended for the position of Chief Financial Officer for the Northeast region, with a salary tripled and full access to the company's highest-level financial systems. At the bottom of the page was Grant Ashford's signature, dated just 7 days before Jason died. "Your husband was not my enemy, Mrs. Kingston," Grant said, his voice dropping lower. "Jason was one of the most talented men I ever hired. He was honest, meticulous, and he had an eye for discovering irregularities that no one else could match. I intended to move him higher, to make him my right hand in financial operations. Why would I ever want to kill a man like that?" Blair shook her head, refusing to believe what she was hearing. "Jason called me that night. He told me he had uncovered a massive money laundering system. He said your company's name right before." "Yes," Grant cut in, and suddenly his voice turned sharper, colder. "Your husband did uncover a money laundering system, but it was not mine." Blair blinked, unable to understand. Grant took one step closer, his gray eyes fixed on hers. "There is a traitor inside my organization, Mrs. Kingston. Someone built a separate laundering network under the cover of Ashford Holdings' legitimate transactions. Jason found it, and that person decided to silence your husband forever before he could report it to me." Blair let out a bitter laugh, harsh with disbelief. "You expect me to believe you are innocent? That someone else is behind Jason's death? How naive do you think I am?" Grant gave a slight shrug, his expression unchanged. "I don't care whether you believe me or not. The truth remains the truth, whether you accept it or refuse it. But if you truly want to find the person who killed your husband, you are hunting the wrong prey." Blair stood frozen, her mind reeling. For 2 years, she had built everything around the conviction that Grant Ashford was the murderer. Every clue, every piece of evidence, every theory had circled back to this man. But now, standing before him in this cold records room, she began to sense a truth far more frightening than the one she had carried for so long. Perhaps she had been wrong. Or worse, perhaps she had been nothing more than a piece on a board in a game whose rules she had never understood. And the man standing before her, with those unreadable eyes, might be her enemy, might be her ally, or might somehow be both at the same time. Grant said nothing more. He simply turned and walked out of the records room, then motioned for Blair to follow. She hesitated for a brief moment before stepping after him, not because she trusted him, but because she knew she had no other choice left. They moved through the silent hallway, entered the private elevator reserved for executives, and went straight up to the 42nd floor. When the elevator doors opened, Blair stepped into Grant Ashford's office, and she had to admit that it felt like an entirely different world. The room stretched across nearly 2,000 square feet, with the entire eastern wall made of reinforced glass from floor to ceiling, overlooking Atlantic City drowned beneath the night rain. The floor was laid in polished black oak. A leather sofa, the color of dark wine, sat in one corner, beside a liquor cabinet filled with dozens of expensive bottles of whiskey and cognac. At the center stood an enormous walnut desk, and behind it rose bookshelves that reached all the way to the ceiling, crowded with antique leather-bound volumes and works of art. Everything was dark, everything was expensive, everything spoke of the absolute power of the man who owned the room. Grant crossed to the liquor cabinet, poured whiskey into 2 crystal glasses, and set one in front of Blair. She looked at the amber liquid, but did not touch it, her eyes following his every movement the way one watches a venomous snake. Grant sat down in the chair opposite her, took a sip of whiskey, then placed the glass on the desk. "Now you have 2 choices, Mrs. Kingston. The first choice is that I call the police right now. You will be arrested for trespassing and attempted theft of confidential documents. With that on your record, you will spend at least 3 years in prison. And your daughter, Rosie, 7 years old, who is currently asleep in that miserable trailer in Pinewood, will be taken into state custody." Blair felt as though someone had just driven a knife into her chest. Her hand clenched so tightly that her nails bit into her palm, but not a single emotion showed on her face. Grant continued, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "The second choice is that you come to work for me, officially, legally, in the very position your husband held before he died. You will have access to every financial record in this company, every transaction, every document you need in order to find the person who killed Jason. Blair frowned, unable to hide her suspicion. Why would you give me that chance? What do you gain from it? Grant set his glass down and looked directly into her eyes. Because you are the only person in this world with a real reason to find the truth. Everyone else who works for me does it for money, for power, for ambition. But you would do it for something stronger than all of those things. You would do it for hatred. And hatred, Mrs. Kingston, is a fire that never dies. Blair fell silent for a long while, her mind racing through every possibility. This could be a trap. It could be Grant's way of controlling her, watching her, and disposing of her once she was no longer useful. But it could also be the only chance she would ever have to get close to the truth without risking her life every single night. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and unwavering. I have one condition. My daughter, Rosie. No one in your organization is to know she exists. No one is to go near her, watch her, or even speak her name. If anyone lays a hand on my child. Grant tilted his head, and a flicker of curiosity passed through his gray eyes. Then what? Blair looked straight at him, her voice dropping into the low growl of a beast defending its young. Then I will forget everything about the truth, about the traitor, about my husband's death. I will spend the rest of my life destroying you, even if I have to drag both of us down into hell to do it. The room fell silent. Grant looked at Blair without blinking, and for the first time that night, something changed in his eyes. It was not fear. Grant Ashford did not know fear, but it was respect, the kind of respect he reserved only for opponents worthy of it. All right, he said with a nod. Your daughter will be protected. No one will know. No one will touch her. He rose to his feet and extended his hand toward Blair. She looked at that hand for a moment, then stood and took it. Grant's hand was cold as stone, the handshake firm and powerful. This was not the handshake of friendship or trust. It was the handshake of two enemies standing on the same side for a little while. Blair let go, her voice glacial. I don't trust you. I never will. Don't mistake this arrangement for anything else. Grant gave a faint smile, one that never reached his eyes. Good. In this world, trust is the most dangerous thing there is. It gets people killed. The less you trust me, the longer you will live. At 4 a.m, Blair stepped out of Ashford Tower with the fresh scent of printer's ink still rising from the employment contract in her hand. The rain had eased, leaving only a fine mist hanging in the cold air. She lifted her eyes to the 42-story tower as it slowly faded into the pale haze before dawn. And she knew that from this moment on, her life would never be the same again. On Monday morning, Blair walked into Ashford Tower through the main entrance for the first time in her life. She was no longer a janitor slipping through the back door at midnight. Now she passed through the front gates, with an official employee badge clipped to her chest. The lobby stretched wide and immense, its polished white marble floor reflecting her image like a giant mirror. Overhead, a vast crystal chandelier hung from the soaring ceiling, scattering light in shimmering waves like thousands of diamonds. The receptionist behind the desk looked Blair up and down with open suspicion, making no effort to hide it. Blair knew exactly how she looked. The old charcoal gray suit she had bought from a thrift store hung a little too loosely at the shoulders because she had grown so much thinner after 2 years of wrestling with life. Her brown hair was tied neatly at the nape of her neck. No makeup, no jewelry. She did not belong in this place. Everyone knew it, and so did she. But she held her head high and walked with steady steps, because she had not come here to fit in. She had come here to find the person who had killed her husband. The elevator stopped on the 35th floor, the accounting department. Blair stepped out and immediately felt dozens of eyes turn toward her. It was an open office, with rows of orderly desks, employees seated before computer screens, and the soft clatter of keyboards that suddenly fell silent. A tall, lean man moved toward her. He looked to be about 55 years old, with salt and pepper hair brushed back from his face, and a gaunt, angular countenance whose sharp lines seemed carved from granite. Blair Kingston. He spoke her name not as a question, but as a statement. His voice was deep and cold as the breath of winter. I am Walter Briggs, head of accounting. So you are the one they chose to replace Jason Kingston. The way he emphasized the word replace made Blair feel as though she had just been slapped across the face. There was something in Walter Briggs's ashen eyes, a deep contempt mixed with something else she couldn't yet define. She marked his name in the list, forming silently in her mind. Walter Briggs, the first person who would need a closer look. Your desk is over there. Walter pointed toward the far end of the office. By coincidence, it happens to be the very spot your predecessor used. All his personal belongings were cleared out long ago, but feel free to settle in. Blair walked toward the desk assigned to her, feeling Walter Briggs's gaze burning between her shoulder blades. The desk stood in the corner of the room beside a window overlooking the city, a place somewhat removed from the other employees. Jason had sat here. He had worked here. He had uncovered a deadly secret in this very place. She sat down and began arranging the basic office supplies that had already been laid out for her. When she pulled open the top drawer to place her handbag inside, she stopped. The drawer was empty and spotless, yet something seemed strange about the bottom. She leaned down for a closer look and discovered an old coin taped beneath the drawer with a strip of clear adhesive, done so skillfully that it would have been almost impossible to notice without looking carefully. Blair removed the coin with cautious fingers and turned it over. It was an old silver coin, the design on the back nearly worn away, but someone had carved 3 numbers into it with a sharp object. 7, 15, 22. She did not understand what those numbers meant, but there was one thing she knew with certainty. Jason had hidden this coin here on purpose. He had left behind a clue, perhaps for her, perhaps for anyone curious enough to search for it. She slipped the coin into the pocket of her jacket and decided she would investigate it later. At lunch, Blair sat alone in the farthest corner of the employee cafeteria. She was not hungry, but she needed to observe. Around her, the employees gathered in small clusters, laughing and talking, yet no one came near her table. Now and then she caught someone glancing in her direction, only to look away again with a murmur of whispers. She knew they were talking about her, about Jason Kingston's widow, about the woman reckless enough to step into the tiger's den. Then suddenly a lunch tray was set down across from her, and a young woman sat in the seat opposite Blair. The girl looked about 29 years old, with bright red hair cut just to her shoulders, vivid blue eyes shining with restless life, and a face dusted with freckles. "Don't mind those people," the young woman said, her voice gentle but touched with a stubborn edge. "Everyone here treats newcomers like that. In a few weeks, they will find someone else to gossip about." Blair looked at the stranger warily. "Thank you, but I don't need anyone to be my friend." The red-haired girl did not seem offended. She merely offered a faint smile, then leaned forward and lowered her voice to a whisper. "I am Penny Marsh from administration on the 34th floor. And I know who you are, Mrs. Kingston. I also know you did not come here to work as an accountant." Blair went still, her hand tightening around the fork. Penny continued, her voice still no more than a whisper. "Jason Kingston. Everyone here says it was a tragic accident, but I don't believe in accidents, and I don't think you do either." "What do you want?" Blair asked, her voice guarded. Penny fell silent for a moment, as though weighing her words. Then she rose to her feet and picked up her tray. "Nothing at all. I only wanted to warn you about one thing. Be careful with what you find here. Not everything is worth knowing, and not everyone is worth trusting." She turned and walked away, but after a few steps, she stopped and glanced back over her shoulder. "If you need to talk, my office is on the 34th floor, at the end of the hall on the right. I usually stay late." Blair watched Penny Marsh disappear through the cafeteria doors, then slipped her hand into her jacket pocket and touched the cold coin marked with its 3 mysterious numbers, 7, 15, 22. Jason had left something behind for her, and Penny Marsh, that strange young woman with the red hair, might know more than she was saying. On the first day, 2 clues. The game had truly begun. 2 weeks had passed since Blair first set foot in the accounting department on the 35th floor. She had gradually grown used to the probing looks, the whispers behind her back, and Walter Briggs's deliberate coldness. Every day she arrived early and left late, burying herself in numbers and files, doing the work assigned to her while quietly searching for clues about Jason's death. The coin with the 3 mysterious numbers remained in her pocket each day like a silent reminder. On Wednesday afternoon, Blair was sitting in front of her computer, her eyes moving across the third quarter financial spreadsheets, when her personal phone vibrated inside her desk drawer. She glanced at the screen, and her heart began to pound when she saw the number for Pinewood Elementary School. She picked up at once, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Kingston? This is Nurse Harris from the school. Your daughter, Rosie, has a very high fever, nearly 104 degrees. We need you to come get her immediately." Blair felt as though someone had just thrown a bucket of ice water in her face. Rosie, her little girl, the 7-year-old child she had sworn to protect at any cost. She looked at the clock, 2 in the afternoon, with 3 more hours before the workday ended. She had no relatives in this city, no one who could help her pick up her daughter in an emergency. Blair stood and walked quickly to Walter Briggs's desk. He was seated there, reviewing a stack of reports, and did not bother to look up when she stopped in front of him. "Mr. Briggs, I need permission to leave early. My daughter is sick. The school just called." Walter slowly lifted his gaze, his ashen eyes fixed on her with their familiar coldness. "You have only been here for 2 weeks, Mrs. Kingston. We are in the middle of quarterly audit season, and you want to leave early for a personal matter? My daughter has a high fever. I have no one else who can pick her up." Walter gave a slight shrug and turned back to his reports. "That is your problem, not the company's. If you leave now, don't expect to come back." Blair stood there, her hands clenched tight at her sides. She looked at Walter Briggs, at the cruel indifference in his eyes, and she understood that she had no choice. Rosie mattered more than any job, more than any investigation, more even than the truth about Jason's death. She turned and walked away without another word. An hour later, Blair returned to the office with Rosie in her arms. The 7-year-old girl, with brown curls like her mother's, was resting her head on Blair's shoulder, her cheeks flushed with fever, her brown eyes dull with exhaustion. In her arms she clutched an old worn teddy bear, one ear torn and stitched back together with thread of a different color. Blair had no choice but to bring her daughter to work. She couldn't leave Rosie alone in the cold trailer while she was sick. She settled Rosie in the corner of the room, where there was a small sofa for waiting guests. She took off her own coat and draped it over her daughter, then gently smoothed the damp curls from the little girl's forehead. "Sit here and be good, sweetheart. Mommy will be right over there. If you call me, I will come straight to you." Rosie nodded weakly, hugging her teddy bear to her chest. Blair had only been back at her desk for a few minutes when the office door swung open. The air in the room froze at once, as though someone had poured liquid nitrogen into the space. Every employee rose abruptly from their chair. Even Walter Briggs hurried to his feet and adjusted his tie. Grant Ashford walked in, his black 3-piece suit flawless and without a single crease, his eyes sweeping across the room as though surveying a battlefield. "I want to see the audit progress report." His voice was not loud, yet it carried through the room like distant thunder. Walter hurried forward with a stack of documents in hand, but Grant did not look at him. His gray eyes had stopped at the corner of the room, where a small child sat curled up with a teddy bear, completely out of place in the middle of an office. Grant moved toward that corner, his steps slow but unwavering. Blair stood at once and rushed to place herself in front of her daughter, her brown eyes meeting his gray ones without flinching. But Grant did not look at her. He looked past her, directly at the child sitting behind her. "Who is that little girl?" he asked, not so much asking Blair as asking the air itself. Rosie, feverish and tired though she was, lifted her eyes to the tall man standing before her with the innocent curiosity only a child could possess. She was not frightened the way the adults around her were. She only tilted her head and answered for herself in a raspy voice made hoarse by fever. "I'm Rosie." "Who are you?" The whole office seemed to stop breathing. No one dared move. No one dared make a sound. It was the first time any of them had ever seen someone speak to Grant Ashford in that way, and that someone was a 7-year-old girl clutching a teddy bear. Grant was silent for a moment. Then he answered, and his voice unexpectedly softened by a note no one in the room had ever heard from him before. "Grant. My name is Grant." Rosie looked at him, then down at the teddy bear in her hands, then back up again. "Do you have a teddy bear, Mr. Grant?" "No." She tilted her head to one side, her wide brown eyes resting on him with something like pity, as though she had just heard the saddest news in the world. "Then when you feel sad, what do you hug?" The simple question from a 7-year-old child dropped into the silence like a stone cast into a still lake, sending invisible ripples through the room. Grant Ashford stood there, motionless, his eyes locked on the child's clear brown gaze. 24 years. For 24 years he had not held anyone, had not let anyone hold him, had not admitted to anyone, not even to himself, that there were times when he felt sadness. He turned abruptly, and when he spoke, his voice had returned to its usual coldness. "The meeting is postponed until 4 o'clock. Everyone returned to work." Then he walked out of the room without looking back, leaving behind a crowd of stunned employees and a 7-year-old child staring after him in confusion. Walter Briggs turned to Blair, his voice still cold but now touched with something like surprise. "It seems you have been spared." This time, Blair did not answer. She sat down beside Rosie and gathered her daughter into her arms. The little girl looked up at her mother and spoke in a tiny voice. "Mommy, that man looked so sad. Why has no one given him a teddy bear?" Blair did not know how to answer, because in that brief moment, when Grant Ashford looked into Rosie's eyes, she had seen something through the steel armor of the most powerful kingpin on the East Coast. It was not cruelty. It was not contempt. It was loneliness. The deep, aching loneliness of an abandoned child who had never been healed. That night, Grant Ashford did not go home. He sat alone in his office on the 42nd floor, without turning on the lights, with only the glow of Atlantic City below, rising through the glass wall and casting wavering ribbons of light across the dark wooden floor. The glass of whiskey on his desk remained untouched. The ice had melted long ago, but he had not lifted it once. He simply sat there, motionless, staring into the emptiness. The child's question kept echoing in his mind, like a bell that would not stop ringing. "What do you hug when you feel sad?" Such a simple question, spoken by a feverish 7-year-old girl clutching a worn teddy bear. Yet that question had pierced every layer of armor Grant had built around himself over the past 24 years, and reached the wound he had believed had healed long ago. He was not sad. He did not have the right to be sad. Sadness was a luxury reserved for the weak, and Grant Ashford was not permitted to be weak. Never. But tonight, in the darkness of the most powerful office in the city, the memory he had tried to bury for 2 decades came rushing back like a tide that couldn't be held back. He saw that room again, that cheap rented room in the slums of South Baltimore, with its walls stained by mold, its ceiling leaking whenever it rained, its air always thick with the stench of garbage from the alley below. He saw again the skinny 9-year-old boy in patched and torn clothes, curled up in the dark corner of the room, both hands clutching an old piece of flowered fabric against his chest. That scrap of cloth was the only thing he had left of his mother, a fragment of the shawl she used to wrap around herself whenever she rocked him to sleep, the only thing that still carried a trace of her warmth after everything else had been sold to pay the debts. He heard the door slam shut. He heard the weary footsteps of his mother leaving the room, this time not to go to the market or to take some odd job. This time, she was leaving never to return. He heard the child calling after her, his voice hoarse with terror. "Mommy, please don't go. I am begging you. I will be good. I promise I will be good." But she kept walking. She did not leave him because she did not love him. Grant understood that now, as a grown man. She left because she no longer had the strength to keep living. Endless poverty, sickness with no money for treatment, despair piling up day after day had killed her from the inside long before her body stopped breathing. She walked out through that door, and 2 days later they found her body beneath the bridge, cold and alone, just as she had been through the final years of her life. The 9-year-old boy sat in the dark corner of that room for 3 days, holding the piece of flowered cloth, not eating, not drinking, not crying. His tears had dried up on the first night, and in those days of hell, that child made himself a vow that would shape the whole course of his life. Never be weak again, never need anyone again, never let anything or anyone hurt him again. Grant opened his eyes and pulled himself back from the abyss of memory. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled open the drawer of his desk. Beneath the important files, beneath the multi-million-dollar contracts and the confidential papers, lay something no one else in this world knew existed. An old piece of flowered fabric, faded by time, its edges frayed and worn, yet still folded with great care. 24 years. He had kept it for 24 years, carrying it from Baltimore to New York, from New York to Atlantic City, through countless homes, countless offices, countless versions of his life. He had never told anyone about it, never admitted that it existed, never allowed anyone to see it. But tonight, for the first time in many years, Grant touched the cloth. His fingers moved across its rough surface, and he remembered what it felt like to be held by his mother. He remembered her warmth. He remembered the nights when she sang him to sleep, in a voice made hoarse by exhaustion, the child's eyes from earlier that day. Rosie. Those large brown eyes that had looked at him with innocent curiosity, without a trace of fear, without a trace of calculation. She had asked him what he hugged when he felt sad with genuine concern, as though not having a teddy bear to hold were the saddest thing in the world. Grant picked up the desk phone and dialed the internal number for the head of security. "The child from accounting today. Rosie Kingston, Blair Kingston's daughter. I want a full report on my desk tomorrow morning. Which school she attends, where she lives, what her circumstances are. Everything. He hung up without explaining why. He did not know the reason himself. That child had nothing to do with him, nothing to do with the investigation, nothing to do with any strategic calculation. But when he looked into Rosie's eyes, Grant had seen something that made it impossible for him to turn away. He had seen himself 24 years earlier, a skinny 9-year-old boy clutching a piece of flowered cloth, waiting for someone to come and save him, and no one ever did. And perhaps, only perhaps, he did not want this child to spend her life waiting that way. 3 weeks had passed since the day Rosie appeared in the office and asked a question that had left even Grant Ashford frozen in place. Blair's life had settled into a strange rhythm. By day, she did the work of an accountant, like every other employee. By night, she became a detective, digging through every corner of the company's records system in search of clues about Jason's death. On Friday night, close to 11 o'clock, the office on the 35th floor was completely deserted. Blair sat alone in front of her computer screen, its pale blue light reflecting across her tired face. In the pocket of her suit jacket, the silver coin with the 3 mysterious numbers still rested there like a silent reminder. 7, 15, 22. For 3 weeks, she had tried every possible way to decipher what those numbers meant, and still, she had found nothing. Tonight, she decided to try a different direction. She accessed the internal archive system and searched for old files Jason had once worked on. Most of them were password protected. She tried the string of numbers from the coin, 7, 15, 22, without spaces. Nothing. She tried adding separators, 7-15-22, still nothing. She paused for a moment, then tried them in reverse. 22, 15, 7. The screen flickered. A hidden folder appeared, named with plain simplicity, Personal Backup. Blair held her breath and clicked it open. Inside there was only one file, an Excel spreadsheet labeled Project S. She opened it, and what appeared before her made her clamp a hand over her mouth to stop herself from crying out. It was a complex spreadsheet with hundreds of lines of data, meticulously recording every financial transaction over the past decade. Enormous sums, tens of millions of dollars, had been transferred from shell companies into a separate account system that did not appear anywhere in the official books of Ashford Holdings. It was evidence of a parallel laundering network, built with terrifying sophistication and operating inside the heart of the corporation without anyone knowing. Blair scrolled down to the bottom of the spreadsheet, her heart beating faster with every line. In the final column, the person responsible for each transaction was marked with a mysterious reference code, and this tag appeared over and over like a ghost haunting every page. WB, 2 simple letters that looked more like a tag than a name, yet enough to make Blair's heart stop. She immediately thought of the only person with those initials, Walter Briggs, the head of accounting with the face carved from stone, the man who had treated her with contempt from the very first day. She hurriedly copied the file onto her personal flash drive, erased every trace of access, and shut down the computer. Her mind spun with possibilities. If Walter Briggs was the one behind this laundering system, then he could also be the man who had killed Jason to keep him silent. But she needed more evidence, more information, before she could allow herself to draw any final conclusion. Blair thought of Penny Marsh, the red-haired young woman who had warned her during lunch on the first day. If you ever need to talk, my office is on the 34th floor, at the end of the hall on the right. It was too late to call or send a message, but Blair knew Penny often stayed late as well. She decided to take the chance. The 34th floor was as silent as the 35th, with only the dim red exit lights glowing near the emergency stairwells. Blair walked down the corridor, past darkened conference rooms, until she saw a sliver of light spilling through the crack beneath the last door at the end of the hall. She knocked softly. The door opened, and Penny Marsh stood there looking surprised, though not entirely. The red-haired girl motioned Blair inside, closed the door carefully behind her, then pulled the curtains shut across the window. I am guessing you found something, Penny said in a low voice. Blair nodded. And I need to know what you know about Jason. Penny was silent for a moment, as though weighing whether to speak. Then she let out a long breath, sat down in her chair, and gestured for Blair to take the seat across from her. Jason and I used to date, she said. Nearly 3 years, before he met you. We broke up because of work, because of distance, because of all the foolish reasons young people always seem to invent. But we stayed in touch. We stayed good friends. Blair felt a sharp sting in her chest, but she forced it down. This was not the moment to be jealous of the past, Penny went on, her voice growing lower. About a week before he died, Jason called me at midnight. His voice was shaking. I had never heard him so frightened. He told me he had discovered something enormous, a secret that could bring down the whole corporation. Did he tell you what it was? Blair asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Penny shook her head. No, he only said one thing that I did not understand at the time, but looking back now, I think it matters. He said it was not about Grant Ashford. It was about someone closer to Grant, someone Grant trusted completely. Blair immediately thought of Walter Briggs and the 2 letters WB on the spreadsheet. Penny looked straight into Blair's eyes, her voice grave. There is one more thing. In his final days, Jason told me he felt like he was being watched. Someone was watching everything he did, reading his emails, listening to his calls. And if they were doing that to Jason, I would not be surprised if they are doing the same thing to you. A chill spread across the back of Blair's neck. I don't know anything more than that, Penny said. But if you find more evidence, tell me. Jason deserves to have his name cleared, and whoever did this to him deserves to pay for it. The 2 women exchanged their personal numbers and agreed to communicate through an encrypted messaging app to avoid being monitored. Blair left Penny's office and walked back down the dark corridor toward the elevator. But for the entire length of that walk, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her from inside the shadows. She stepped into the elevator, her hand gripping the flash drive inside her jacket pocket. The evidence was in her possession. The trail was clearer than it had ever been, but she also knew that from this moment forward, she was walking a tightrope, and one wrong step could send her plunging into the abyss, just as Jason had fallen before her. The next morning, the report Grant had requested was already waiting on his desk. It was a thin file, only a few pages long, yet it contained the whole life of a 7-year-old child laid bare in the form of dry, emotionless lines. Rosie Kingston, born March 12th, 7 years old. Currently living with her mother, Blair Kingston, at Pinewood Trailer Park, Lot 17. Attends Jefferson Public Elementary School, about 2 miles from home, and walks there each day because her mother has to leave for work early. Living conditions: 1-room trailer, approximately 300 square feet, in deteriorating condition, with an unreliable heating system. Household income: limited to the salary of a newly hired accounting employee, leaving almost nothing after lot rent and fixed expenses are paid. Regular meals: sandwiches, instant noodles, sometimes eggs or cheese. Grant read every line, his face as expressionless as stone, but his hand tightened around the pages, gripping so hard that his fingers turned white and the edges of the paper crumpled. He had seen cold numbers like these thousands of times in financial reports, yet never before had numbers made him feel as though someone were closing a hand around his heart. That afternoon, Grant ordered his driver to take him to Pinewood, not to meet anyone, not to do anything in particular, only to look. The black Bentley stopped at the corner of the street about 50 yards from the trailer park, far enough away not to draw notice, close enough to see everything clearly. Pinewood looked like a vast parking lot for dead dreams. Rows of old trailers stood unevenly in place, their paint peeling, their awnings crooked and sagging. Children played in open patches of ground choked with weeds, wearing old clothes and carrying dust on their knees. This was the kind of place civilized society chose to forget, the kind of place men like Grant Ashford never set foot in. Around 4 in the afternoon, Grant saw Blair appear at the far end of the dirt road leading into the trailer park. She was still wearing the same old suit she wore to work, carrying a plastic bag of groceries in one hand, her walk heavy with the weariness of a long day. A small figure skipped ahead of her, brown curls flying in the late afternoon wind. Rosie, the little girl, was hopping along the dirt road, turning back to say something to her mother, both hands waving in the air to act out whatever story she was telling. Blair bent her head to listen, and a tired smile appeared on her face, though her eyes were full of love. Mother and daughter made their way toward the trailer at Lot 17, and when the door opened, it revealed a narrow, dim little space inside. Grant sat in the car watching that scene for a long time. A strange feeling rose in his chest, not the kind of pity wealthy people so often bestow on the poor. This was recognition. He recognized the image of a 7-year-old child skipping beside her mother in a broken neighborhood, and he remembered the 9-year-old boy who had once lived in a damp room in Baltimore 24 years earlier. The only difference was that Rosie still had her mother. She still had someone to tell her stories to. She still had a smile waiting for her at the end of the school day. Grant took out his phone and called his personal attorney. I need to ask you something. What is the best private elementary school in the Atlantic City area for children? The lawyer on the other end sounded surprised, but his answer remained professional. St. Catherine Academy, sir. It is the most prestigious private school in the region, with an excellent academic program and modern facilities, but the tuition is extremely high, around $40,000 a year, and the waiting list usually runs 2 to 3 years. Grant did not hesitate. I want an anonymous scholarship fund established through an intermediary charitable organization. The source of the funding must remain completely hidden. No one is to know where the money came from. The student receiving the scholarship will be Rosie Kingston, Blair Kingston's daughter, beginning next term. Arrange everything. Would you like the scholarship to cover full expenses or only part of them, sir? Full expenses. Tuition, books, uniforms, lunches, and any other fees. That child is not to worry about anything connected to money when she goes to school. I understand. I will take care of it immediately, sir. Grant ended the call and looked out through the car window one more time. The trailer at Lot 17 had already closed its door, and a faint yellow light slipped through the gaps in the thin curtains. Somewhere inside that cramped little space, a 7-year-old child might have been eating instant noodles for dinner and telling her mother about what had happened at school that day. He signaled for the driver to pull away, unaware that the decision he had made in those few short minutes would change many lives, including his own. 2 months had passed since the night Blair discovered Jason's hidden spreadsheet. For 2 months, she had lived in a state of constant tension, working by day like an ordinary employee, then spending her nights analyzing every number in the data file, trying to fit the scattered fragments together into one complete picture. And through all those 2 months, she had been unable to shake the feeling of being watched, the very feeling Penny had warned her about. On Thursday night, close to 10 o'clock, Blair's phone began to vibrate. A message from Grant Ashford's internal number appeared on the screen, brief and cold, just like the man who had sent it. Come to my office. Right now. Blair stepped into the private elevator leading to the 42nd floor with every nerve sharpened in caution. For the past 2 months, she and Grant had scarcely spoken directly at all. He kept his distance, and so did she. But she knew he was watching, knew that nothing happened in this building without his knowledge. When the office doors opened, Grant was standing beside the glass wall, looking out over the city at night. He did not turn when Blair entered. He only motioned for her to sit in the chair opposite his desk. What have you found in the past 2 months? His voice carried through the darkness. Not quite a question so much as a statement. Blair sat down with her back straight, still on guard. She hesitated, unsure how much she should reveal. The spreadsheet, the numbers, the initials W.B. She had guarded that secret for 2 months and told no one but Penny. Grant turned then, and his gray eyes settled directly on her. Don't waste time thinking about how you are going to lie. I know you found the hidden file Jason left behind. I also know you have met with Penny Marsh at least 3 times over the past 2 months, each time at different locations outside the company. Blair felt as though she had just been struck across the face. He knew everything. From the beginning to the end, he had known everything. Grant walked to his desk, opened one of the drawers, and took out a thick file. He placed it on the desk and pushed it toward Blair. This is the result of my own investigation. It began 3 years ago, when I realized someone was siphoning money out of the company's secondary accounts. Blair opened the file and skimmed the first pages. The numbers, the shell companies, the suspicious transactions. They matched almost exactly what she had found in Jason's file. Your husband did not die in an accident, Grant said, his voice dropping lower. His car's brakes were tampered with. A small cut was made in the brake line, enough for the fluid to leak out gradually over the course of a long drive. By the time the car reached the mountain road, the brakes failed completely. Blair caught her breath, her throat tightening as though a hand had closed around it. She had suspected this for a long time, but hearing it confirmed still hurt with the same savage force as the first day. I know, she whispered. I always knew it was not an accident. Grant nodded. But you don't know who did it. He turned to one page in the file and pushed it toward her. There was a portrait photograph of a man around 40 years old, his face plain and forgettable, the kind of face people would forget the moment they looked away. Marcus Webb, head of information technology, the man who controls the entire security system, the camera network, and the database of Ashford Holdings. Blair stared at the photograph, then looked back up at Grant. Not Walter Briggs, the WB, in Jason's file. Grant shook his head. Walter has been my man since the first day you set foot in the company. He pretended to be cold and contemptuous toward you, so no one would suspect him, so you would investigate in the wrong direction, and so the real traitor would feel safe that he had not yet been exposed. The WB in Jason's file wasn't a person's initials. It was Marcus Webb's private ledger code. He used it to mask his identity, knowing people would instinctively point their fingers at Walter Briggs if the file was ever found. Blair felt her thoughts begin to spin. For 2 months she had focused on Walter Briggs, had believed he was the man behind everything. And now she learned that he had been Grant's ally all along, planted there to protect her. Grant continued, his voice cold as ice. Marcus built his own laundering system over nearly 10 years, using my company as cover, using his position to conceal every trace. Jason discovered it, and Marcus decided to silence him forever. Then why are you telling me all this? Blair asked, her voice still trembling. Why not deal with him yourself? Grant turned away and looked back toward the glass wall. The lights of the city reflected in his gray eyes and made them seem like 2 frozen lakes. Because Marcus knows you are searching. He knows you found Jason's file. He knows you are getting closer and closer to the truth. And he is preparing to remove you, the same way he removed your husband. Blair felt the blood in her body turn cold. Grant turned back to face her, and for the first time, Blair saw something different in his eyes, something other than the usual chill and calculation. There was one thing I did not anticipate when I began this game. What? Grant was silent for a moment, as though measuring every word before he spoke it. Your daughter, Rosie. She was never supposed to be part of this equation. She is only an innocent 7-year-old child. She has nothing to do with the war beneath the surface, between Marcus and me. He paused, and his voice dropped so low that Blair had to lean forward to hear him clearly. But now, I cannot allow anything to happen to her, and that changes everything. Blair looked at Grant Ashford, searching for any sign of deception, of manipulation, of the cold strategy she had come to expect from him. But she found none. There was only truth, bare and painful, reflected in the eyes of the man who had once stood at the top of her list of enemies. After that night in Grant's office, Blair returned to Pinewood Trailer Park with her mind in turmoil. The information about Marcus Webb, about the plot to kill Jason, about the danger closing in around her, all of it churned through her thoughts like a storm that would not settle. But what frightened her most was not her own safety. It was Rosie. In the days that followed, Blair began to notice things that she might once have ignored. A black sedan parked at the corner of the street, about 50 yards from the trailer park, appearing every evening when she came home from work and vanishing before dawn. The first time, she thought it was simply someone's car in the neighborhood. The second time, she began to pay attention. By the 5th time, she knew it was no coincidence. When she went grocery shopping over the weekend, she felt as though someone was following her. It was not a vague sensation, but the cold certainty of survival instinct. She stopped abruptly at a produce stand, pretending to examine the fruit, and glanced over her shoulder. A man in a gray jacket stood about 10 yards away, pretending to look at his phone. When she continued walking, he followed. When she stopped, he stopped too. Her phone also began to show strange signs. Every time she made or received a call, she heard a small click, as though someone were connecting into the line. Sometimes there were odd pockets of silence between sentences, as though the signal were being routed through some intermediary device. Blair tried to convince herself that she was becoming paranoid, that stress and sleeplessness were making her see things that were not really there. But a mother's instinct, the instinct to protect her child, sharpened by 2 years of living in fear and grief, would not let her dismiss these signs. On Friday afternoon, Blair left work earlier than usual because Rosie had the day off from school. She picked her daughter up from the neighbor's house as she always did, and then the two of them walked back to the trailer. When they reached the door, Blair stopped short. The trailer door was slightly ajar, only by a narrow crack, just enough for the late afternoon light to slip inside. She was certain she had locked it that morning. She always locked it. Blair pushed Rosie behind her and slowly opened the door. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. The old sofa was still in its place. The small dining table still held its 2 chairs. The curtains were still drawn to one side just as she had left them that morning. But Blair noticed the small details that an ordinary person would have missed. The drawer in her wardrobe stood open by the slightest margin, though she always pushed it all the way shut after taking something out. Rosie's toys on the shelf had been shifted, and the old worn teddy bear was gone. The space where it always sat was empty, a cold void that made Blair's heart skip a beat. The box of important papers beneath the bed had been pulled out a few inches. Someone had been in there. Someone had searched her trailer and tried to hide the evidence. But they did not know that Blair Kingston had lived in fear for 2 years, and she knew every smallest detail of her home by heart. Her heart pounded wildly, and her hands shook so badly that she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. They had come all the way to her home. They knew where she lived, knew she had a daughter, knew everything about her life. Marcus Webb was tightening the noose. That night, Blair held Rosie as they slept on the small bed inside the trailer. The little girl had long since fallen into deep sleep, her breathing soft and even, her face peaceful as an angel's, untouched by any knowledge of the danger lurking around them. But Blair couldn't sleep. She lay there with her eyes wide open, staring at the trailer ceiling stained with patches of dampness, while her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Jason had been followed like this too. He had sensed danger drawing near, and then he died, alone on that mountain road, inside a car with no brakes. She couldn't let that happen to her. Not because she was afraid to die, but because if she died, Rosie would have no one left. Blair knew she couldn't keep fighting alone. She had no money, no power, no one to protect her. But there was one man who had all of those things. A man she had sworn she would never trust. Yet now he was the only choice she had. She took out her phone and opened the encrypted messaging app Grant had given her after their late-night meeting. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed each word. They were inside my house. They searched the trailer. I need to see you. Immediately. She sent the message. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. Then the screen lit up with a brief reply. 7 a.m. Blue Harbor Cafe, corner of Atlantic and Pacific. Come alone. Don't bring Rosie. Blair set the phone down and looked over at Rosie sleeping soundly beside her. She bent down and kissed her daughter lightly on the forehead, whispering into her ear even though she knew the child couldn't hear her. I will protect you, no matter what I have to do, even if I have to join hands with the devil. The Blue Harbor Cafe sat at the corner of Atlantic and Pacific, a small place with a red brick front and a weathered old sign. At 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, it was nearly empty, with only a few older customers reading newspapers and a young couple whispering together by the window. Blair arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table in the far corner, her back against the wall so she could watch the entire entrance. She had left Rosie with Mrs. Jenkins, the kind neighbor who lived in the trailer beside theirs. She told her daughter that she had something important to take care of and would be back before noon. Rosie did not ask many questions. She only hugged her teddy bear and nodded obediently. Her wide brown eyes looked at her mother with complete trust, unaware that the woman who loved her was being forced to make decisions that could change both of their lives. At exactly 7 o'clock, the cafe door opened, and Grant Ashford walked in. He was wearing a simple black leather jacket instead of the 3-piece suits he wore every day, and his hair was slightly disordered, as though he had risen in a hurry. There were no bodyguards, no driver waiting outside, no sign at all that this man was one of the most powerful figures on the east coast of the United States. Grant sat down across from Blair, ordered a black coffee, and looked at her in silence. There was no polite greeting, no useless pretense of ordinary conversation. They both knew this was not a normal meeting. Blair began to speak, her voice quick and precise. She told him about the black sedan that appeared each night near the trailer park, about the man in the gray jacket who had followed her at the market, about the strange clicking sounds on her phone, and about the search of her trailer. She left out nothing. She did not exaggerate. She did not add emotion. She gave him only the truth, cold and frightening. When Grant finished listening, his expression darkened. In his eyes there flashed something dangerous, the look of a predator that had just discovered an enemy trespassing on its territory. Marcus is testing the ground, he said, his voice low as distant thunder. He wants to know what you have, how much you know, and whether you have shared any of it with someone else. This is the stage that comes before he decides whether to strike. Blair tightened her hands around the coffee cup. The heat from the ceramic was not enough to drive the chill from her bones. So what are you going to do? What exactly are you proposing? Grant looked directly into her eyes. From this moment on, you and Rosie will have protection 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. My people, the most trustworthy people I have. They will watch the area around your trailer, take Rosie to and from school, and make sure no one can get near you or your daughter without getting past them first. Blair wanted to refuse. Deep in her heart, She still wanted to handle everything herself. She still did not want to owe this man anything. But the image of the trailer being searched, the image of Rosie's old, worn teddy bear moved from its place, rose sharply in her mind. Someone had touched her daughter's toy. Someone had entered their living space. She had no right to let pride blind her when Rosie's safety was in danger. "All right," she said with a nod, her voice hard. "But I have a condition. I want to know everything. Everything about Marcus Webb, about your plan, about what you have been hiding. No more secrets." Grant was silent for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly against the table as though weighing the cost of each word. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured, as though he were telling the beginning of a long story. "Marcus doesn't want money alone. He wants my position. He wants the chair I am sitting in. He wants control of this entire empire. He has been building his own network for nearly 10 years, placing people in key positions, creating a parallel laundering system so he would have an independent source of money. Every move has been preparation for the day he tries to overthrow me. Jason was the first obstacle he removed. And you, if you keep getting closer to the truth, will be the next." Blair looked at him, her mind moving quickly through the implications. "So you needed me as bait, to draw him out into the open, to give you a reason to bring him down without looking like the one who struck first." Grant did not deny it. "Yes, that was my plan in the beginning. But things have changed now. I am not going to let you face this danger alone anymore." Blair let out a bitter laugh, a laugh with no trace of humor in it. "Why should I believe you have changed? Why should I believe you care about anything except your own interests?" Grant was silent for a long time. His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made Blair fight the urge to look away. Then he spoke, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. "Because if anything happens to Rosie, you will not need to destroy me. I will destroy myself, with my own hands." Blair looked into Grant Ashford's eyes and saw something she had never seen there before. Not the coldness of a powerful kingpin, not the calculation of a master strategist, but truth. A naked and painful truth belonging to a man who had finally found something worth protecting after decades of living without feeling. They left the Blue Harbor Cafe in silence. They were no longer enemies, but they were not yet true allies either. They were only two human beings pushed into the same war, forced to stand on the same side against a common enemy. And in this war, both of them knew that the smallest mistake could cost a life. A week passed after the meeting at the Blue Harbor Cafe. On the surface, everything at Ashford Holdings continued as usual. Employees arrived at the office on time. Meetings were held according to schedule, and financial reports were submitted on deadline. Blair still sat at Jason's old desk on the 35th floor, handling numbers and files like an ordinary accountant. Grant still appeared at board meetings with that cold, unreadable expression, making multi-million-dollar business decisions as though nothing unusual were happening. But beneath that calm surface, a silent war was unfolding. Grant's protection team had been stationed around Pinewood Trailer Park, watching Rosie on her way to school and back home each day. The company's security systems were now being monitored more closely than ever before. Every suspicious transaction, every unusual access to the database, was being recorded and analyzed. Marcus Webb, head of information technology, was not a fool. He had climbed to his position through intelligence and a rare talent for reading people. And during the past week, he had begun to notice subtle changes that an ordinary man would have missed. Blair Kingston, the widow Grant had hired into Jason's position, now seemed to be treated differently. No one said anything openly, but he noticed the way Walter Briggs had suddenly become less cold toward her. The way Grant occasionally glanced in the direction of accounting whenever he passed that corridor. More troubling still, some of the files Marcus once accessed without restriction had now been locked behind new levels of clearance. Someone was beginning to suspect him, and Marcus Webb never waited around to become prey. On Thursday morning, Marcus requested a private meeting with Grant in order to report what he called an urgent security issue. Grant agreed, and the two men sat across from one another in the office on the 42nd floor, with the glass wall behind them reflecting the gray sky over Atlantic City. Marcus began in a tone of practiced concern, saying that he had discovered unauthorized access to sensitive financial files over the past several weeks. Someone, he said, had been searching for information they had no right to see. Perhaps there was an internal spy. Grant looked at him, his face expressionless, and asked whom he suspected. Marcus pretended to hesitate before answering that he did not want to accuse anyone without proof. But Blair Kingston seemed the obvious possibility. She had only been with the company for a few months, yet already had access to important systems, and she was the wife of Jason Kingston, who had also accessed similar files before the accident. Grant replied in a flat voice that he would look into the matter. Marcus nodded and rose to leave, but before stepping through the door, he turned and looked back at Grant one more time. Their eyes met for only an instant, and in that instant, Marcus understood something that sent cold fear down his spine. Grant knew. Grant knew everything, and Grant was playing cat and mouse with him. Marcus left the office with his decision already made. He couldn't wait any longer. If he did not act now, he would be the one destroyed. But striking directly at Blair would be foolish, especially now that she was under Grant's protection. He needed to strike at her weakest point, the one thing she would sacrifice everything to protect, her daughter. That afternoon, a black sport utility vehicle parked about 50 yards from the gate of Jefferson Elementary School. Behind the wheel sat a middle-aged man with a blank face, his eyes watching the children pouring out of the schoolyard when the final bell rang. He was looking for one specific target, a 7-year-old girl with curly brown hair, standing at the edge of the schoolyard clutching an old, worn teddy bear while waiting for her mother. Marcus had intercepted the guards' communications, feeding them a coordinated decoy that forced them to intercept a perceived threat blocks away, leaving a narrow 15-minute window. 15 minutes. 15 minutes would be enough. The man stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward Rosie with a falsely friendly smile. He said something to her, perhaps that her mother was stuck in traffic and had sent him in her place. At first, Rosie shook her head, but then he showed her something on his phone, maybe a photograph of Blair, and the little girl hesitated. That one small moment of hesitation was enough. At 3:20 in the afternoon, Blair was sitting in a meeting room on the 35th floor when her personal phone began to vibrate. She glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. Normally, she would have ignored it, but something deep inside pushed her to answer. Then she heard Rosie's voice, trembling and broken, saying, "Mommy, I'm scared." Blair's heart seemed to stop. She shot up from her chair, her face turning white, oblivious to the startled looks of her colleagues around her. Then, another voice came on the line, a strange man's voice, cold as steel, saying that her daughter was with him, and if she wanted to see the child alive and unharmed, she would do exactly as she was told. Blair felt as though every breath had been ripped from her lungs. Her knees nearly gave way, and she had to grip the back of a chair to keep from falling. But she forced herself to stay calm, forced the tremor out of her voice, and asked where her daughter was, demanding to speak to her again. The man replied that Rosie was fine for now, and if Blair wanted her to remain that way, she would hand over every piece of evidence she had gathered on Marcus Webb. Every file, every copy, every note. After that, she would leave Atlantic City in silence and never return. If she obeyed, her daughter would be released. If she called the police or told anyone else, the little girl would disappear forever. Blair asked how she was supposed to know her daughter was really safe. The man answered that she did not know, and that this was her problem, not his. Then he told her she had 24 hours. The line went dead. Blair stood there, her hand shaking so violently the phone nearly slipped from her fingers. Around her, the meeting continued, voices still speaking, people still moving, but everything dissolved into a meaningless hum in her ears. Only one thought remained, spinning in her mind like a blade. Rosie, her daughter, the only child who still gave her a reason to stay alive. Blair did not call the police. Her first instinct was not to turn to the law. She knew the police couldn't help her. Not fast enough, not forcefully enough, not ruthlessly enough to confront the kind of man who had taken her daughter. There was only one person who could. She dialed Grant Ashford's number, her hands shaking so badly that it took her 3 tries to press the correct digits. The moment he answered, her voice shattered and she said only one word, "Rosie," and then told him they had taken her. There was a second of silence on the other end. Then Grant's voice came through, so cold it sent ice down Blair's spine, asking where, when, and telling her to give him every detail. Blair told him about the call, her voice broken as she fought back tears. The unknown number, Rosie's frightened voice, the kidnapper's demands, the 24-hour deadline. When she finished, there was silence for several seconds. Then Blair heard a sound from the other end of the line, glass shattering, something being hurled against a wall, the heavy breathing of a man trying to contain his fury. Then Grant spoke one word, Marcus. Just one word, one name, but the way he said it made Blair understand that Marcus Webb's fate had already been sealed. Grant told her not to do anything, not to call the police, not to contact anyone, not to try negotiating with them. He said he would handle it. Blair asked how, her voice raw with desperation, because her daughter was in their hands. Grant answered that he knew, and there was something in his voice that made Blair go suddenly still. It was not the coldness of a powerful kingpin. It was the resolve of a man prepared to burn down the whole world to protect what mattered to him. He told her that she did not need to know what he was going to do. She only needed to know one thing, that her daughter would come home safely that night. He promised. Then the line went dead. Grant stood in the middle of his office on the 42nd floor, surrounded by the shattered remains of a whiskey glass and a picture frame he had hurled against the wall. He stood there breathing hard, his eyes burning with a fire no one had ever seen before. He had two choices. One, to walk away. Rosie was not his child, not his responsibility. He could leave Blair to solve her own problem and focus instead on bringing Marcus down by some other method. That was the logical choice, the safe choice. The choice the Grant Ashford of 6 months earlier would have made without hesitation. 2. To save Rosie. To expose his weakness for Marcus to see. To let the whole world know that Grant Ashford, the cold and heartless kingpin, actually cared for something deeply enough to risk everything to protect it. In his mind, Rosie's wide brown eyes appeared before him. Her voice echoed through his thoughts, asking what he held when he felt sad. Grant picked up the phone and called the man he trusted most in the organization. He ordered him to gather the team immediately, because they had work to do that night. He had made his choice, even if it cost him everything. In the basement of an old building on the outskirts of Atlantic City, a place where not even daylight could reach, the room was lit by a few dim overhead bulbs, its concrete walls stained with patches of damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and machine oil. This was one of Grant Ashford's secret locations, a place whose existence was recorded nowhere, a place no security camera ever captured, a place where the most important meetings were often held. Grant stood at the head of a long wooden table, facing 5 men. These were the most loyal men in his organization, the ones who had followed him from the earliest days when he had still been nothing, the ones willing to die for him without ever asking why. They had received his emergency call and arrived within an hour. No one asked questions. No one complained. Grant let his eyes pass over each face, his voice low and steady. Marcus Webb has just kidnapped a 7-year-old child, Blair Kingston's daughter, the woman working in the accounting department of my company. One of the 5, a heavily built man with a scar running down his left cheek, frowned. Does that child have anything to do with us? Or is this Kingston's personal problem? Grant was silent for a moment, his gray eyes fixed on the distance as though weighing every word. Then he spoke, his voice dropping so low it was almost a whisper. Yes, that child has something to do with me. No one in the room dared ask more. They had followed Grant Ashford long enough to know that when he said something had to do with him, that was the only reason they needed. Grant continued, his tone returning to its usual sharp precision. My people have identified the location. Marcus is holding the child in an abandoned warehouse north of the city, in the old industrial district near the docks. He has around 6 to 8 guards, lightly armed, not professionals. He spread a hand-drawn map across the table, marking the warehouse and the surrounding points. We split into 2 teams. Team 1, 3 men, approaches from the east and makes enough noise to draw attention. Team 2, 2 men with me, enters from the west through the broken 2nd-floor window. Our only objective is to get the child out safely. No engagement unless it becomes unavoidable, and no harm comes to that little girl, not so much as a scratch. The scarred man nodded, then asked, And Marcus Webb? Grant looked straight into his eyes, and there was something in that look that made even the hardest men in the room feel a chill move through them. Leave him to me. I will deal with him myself. The meeting ended, and the 5 men scattered to prepare. Grant took out his phone and dialed Blair. She answered after half a ring, her voice hoarse as though she had spent hours crying. Have you found her yet? Is Rosie all right? I know where they're holding her. We move tonight. Blair drew in a deep breath, and suddenly her voice turned hard. I'm coming with you. She's my daughter. No, Grant said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Rosie needs you alive through tonight. She needs her mother, not a dead hero. Silence hung on the other end of the line. Then Blair's voice came back, breaking, trembling. You promised me. You promised she would come home safe. I promised, Grant answered, and his voice softened by a note so slight that even he did not seem to notice it. And I will keep that promise. You stay where you are, you do nothing, and you wait to hear from me. Before dawn, Rosie will be back in your arms. The call ended. Grant slid into the back seat of the black sport utility vehicle waiting in the parking garage. He did not order the driver to move at once. He only sat there alone in the dark, his head leaning back against the seat, his eyes closed. His hand slipped inside his jacket and touched the old scrap of cloth he always carried with him. The fabric had faded with time, made soft by being touched thousands of times over the course of 24 years. He did not take it out. He only rested his fingers against it, feeling the familiar texture beneath his hand. Tonight, he would do something he had never done for anyone. He would risk everything, his empire, his power, even his life, to save a 7-year-old child he had no obligation at all to protect. But he would do it, because when he looked into Rosie's eyes, he saw himself 24 years earlier, a 9-year-old boy sitting alone in the dark, waiting for someone to come and save him, and no one ever came. Tonight, he would become the person he had once wished had appeared in his life all those years ago. He would fight so that another child would not lose her mother, would not grow up in hatred and loneliness, would not become the kind of thing he himself had become. Grant opened his eyes and tapped lightly on the partition between the passenger cabin and the driver. Let's go. The black sport utility vehicle glided smoothly out of the garage and merged into the traffic of Atlantic City at night. Behind it, 2 more vehicles emerged from different directions, forming a small convoy moving north toward the city's edge. At the same time, inside an abandoned warehouse in the old industrial district, Rosie Kingston sat curled up in a dark corner. Her old worn teddy bear had been taken from her so she would have nothing to hold when fear became too great. Her wrists were tied with strips of cloth, not painful, but tight enough to keep her from slipping free on her own. Around her, strange men moved back and forth, speaking words she did not understand. Rosie was not crying. She had cried until there were no tears left in those first hours. Now she only sat there, her wide brown eyes staring into the darkness, her 7-year-old mind struggling to understand why she was here, why these people had taken her, why her mother had still not come. She closed her eyes, and her lips moved in a whisper no one heard. Will someone come save me? Mommy, will someone come save me? Outside the warehouse, the night was black as ink, but somewhere in that darkness, 3 black vehicles were drawing near, carrying the answer to her prayer. At midnight, the abandoned industrial district north of Atlantic City lay buried in darkness, and a silence so deep it felt unnatural. The old warehouses stood in rows like enormous ghosts, their windows shattered, their walls stained with graffiti and rust. There were no streetlights, no passing cars, only the sound of sea wind blowing in from the nearby docks, carrying with it the smell of salt and corroded metal. Warehouse number 7 stood at the very end of the row, larger than the others, with a warped tin roof and rusted iron doors. A weak yellow light leaked through the cracks of its broken windows, showing that there were people inside. Grant and his team approached from 3 different directions, moving through the darkness like shadows, without a single sound. Inside the warehouse, Rosie sat on an old wooden chair in the corner of the room. Her wrists were tied with soft strips of cloth. Not painful, but tight enough that she couldn't work herself free. Her old worn teddy bear lay on a metal table a few yards away, close enough for her to see, yet far enough that she could never reach it. It was a refined kind of cruelty, inflicted on a 7-year-old child, but Rosie did not cry. Her wide brown eyes were red from the tears she had shed hours earlier, yet now they were dry and strangely resolute for a child her age. In her mind she heard the words her mother always told her whenever she was afraid. When you are scared, think of the thing that makes you feel the bravest. Rosie thought of her mother's tired but loving smile each afternoon when she came to pick her up from school, of the nights when the 2 of them lay wrapped around each other in the little trailer, telling fairy tales until Rosie drifted to sleep. And then, for reasons she did not understand, she thought of Mr. Grant, the tall man with the sad gray eyes, the man who did not have a teddy bear to hold when he felt sad, the man who looked at her with an expression she could never quite understand. Footsteps sounded, and the door behind her opened. Marcus Webb walked in and looked at the child with the indifference of a man staring at an object, not a human being. He stopped a few steps away, one hand in his pocket, his face so ordinary it was almost frightening. "Your mother will be here soon," Marcus said, his voice flat and even. "If she behaves and does exactly what she is told, you will get to go home." Rosie looked straight into his eyes, without blinking, without trembling. "You are a bad man." Marcus let out a thin laugh, a laugh with no warmth in it at all. "There are no good people and bad people in this world, little girl. There are only winners and losers. I am only doing what is necessary to win." Rosie kept looking at him, and in her wide brown eyes there suddenly flickered something almost like pity. "You are going to lose." Marcus had no time to answer because everything happened at once. The lights in the warehouse cut out without warning, and darkness swallowed the room in an instant. Shouts erupted near the main door, followed by the crash of something falling, the pounding of feet scattering in all directions. Someone yelled an order, someone else cried out in pain. Chaos. Rosie stayed still in her chair and squeezed her eyes shut, imagining that she was home with her mother. She imagined the warmth of the little trailer, imagined her mother beside her, imagined the old worn teddy bear safely in her arms. She did not know what was happening, but she knew one thing. Someone had come. The emergency lights flickered on, washing the warehouse in a pale yellow glow, and there, in the middle of that space, Grant Ashford stood like a monument. Around him, Marcus's men had already been taken down, sprawled across the floor, groaning in pain, but none of them badly enough to be in danger of dying. Marcus stood in the corner of the room, with his back against the wall, his face drained of color. He looked at Grant with eyes full of fear, though he tried to cover it with a mask of false calm. "Grant," he said, and there was a slight tremor in his voice. "We can talk. We can make a deal. I have information. I have money. I have." Grant walked toward him, each step slow and threatening. 10 years, Marcus. For 10 years I trusted you. I put you in the most important position in my security system, and you used those 10 years to betray me, to build your own empire right under my nose, to kill my people." He stopped, and his gray eyes burned with hatred. "And now you dared to lay a hand on an innocent child." Marcus stumbled back another step until the wall was behind him, and there was nowhere left to go. "That child has nothing to do with you. She is only the daughter of some nameless accountant." Grant stopped less than 3 feet away and looked directly into the eyes of the traitor before him. "You are wrong. That little girl has everything to do with this, with me, with everything I have tried to bury for the last 20 years. Then Grant turned his back on Marcus and walked toward the corner where Rosie was sitting. He knelt in front of her, his movements astonishingly gentle for a man who had just brought down an entire crew in a matter of minutes. The same fingers accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar contracts now carefully loosened each strip of cloth from the child's small wrists. "Are you hurt anywhere?" Rosie opened her eyes and saw the familiar face before her. Her large brown eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Grant?" Grant nodded, and his voice softened in a way no one had ever heard from him before. "I came to take you home to your mother." Rosie burst into tears, not from fear this time, but from relief, from the overwhelming knowledge that she was safe. She lunged forward and wrapped her arms tightly around Grant's leg, her tears soaking the black fabric of his trousers. Grant stood frozen for a second. He was not used to this. He was not used to closeness, not used to being touched with that kind of complete trust. For 24 years he had built walls around himself so no one could ever reach him. But this 7-year-old child, with her small arms wrapped around his leg, broke through every one of those walls as though they had never existed. Slowly, Grant laid one hand on Rosie's head, brushing lightly over her damp brown curls. This feeling, this warmth, he had forgotten it a very long time ago. The door behind them opened, and Walter Briggs stepped inside. His face, carved as though from stone, swept quickly over the scene in the warehouse, then stopped at Grant and Rosie. "The car is ready to take her home, sir," Walter said, his voice still deep and severe as always. But when he looked down at Rosie, that stone-hard face softened for the first time, and something almost like warmth passed briefly through his ashen eyes. "You were very brave, little one." Grant gently loosened Rosie's hold, lifted her up, and placed her into Walter's arms. "Take her home to her mother immediately. Make sure nothing happens on the way." Walter nodded, gathered Rosie in his arms, and carried her out of the warehouse. The little girl turned her head for one last look at Grant, her brown eyes still wet with tears, yet now shining once more with hope. Grant stood there watching until the two of them disappeared through the doorway. Then he turned back and faced Marcus, who was still trembling in the corner. "You think I'm going to kill you, do you not?" Grant walked toward him, his voice cold as ice. "No. Death would be too easy for a man like you. You will pay, but not with a bullet. You will pay with the rest of your life in prison, watching everything you built collapse around you, knowing that you lost and will never have the chance to come back." The black sport utility vehicle moved smoothly through the empty streets of Atlantic City at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. Grant sat in the back seat with his head resting against the window, watching the streetlights slide past in blurred ribbons of light. The adrenaline from the rescue still ran through his veins, but it was beginning to fade now, leaving behind a deep exhaustion that seeped into every muscle. He shifted slightly, and a sharp pain tore through his left side, making him go still at once. Grant looked down and pressed a hand to the place that hurt. When he pulled it away, his fingers were wet with something thick and warm. In the dim glow filtering through the glass from the streetlights outside, he saw the dark red color. Blood, not sweat. Blood. In the chaos at the warehouse, one of Marcus's men had stabbed him. Grant did not remember the exact moment. He had not felt the pain then. Adrenaline had hidden everything, but now the wound was demanding to be noticed. He tapped lightly on the partition between the passenger compartment and the driver, his voice calm even as blood was soaking through the fabric of his suit. "Back to Ashford Tower, and call my personal physician now." At the same time, the vehicle carrying Rosie came to a stop in front of Pinewood Trailer Park. Blair had been waiting at the door ever since she received the call that her daughter was on the way home, her eyes swollen from hours of crying, her face pale with worry and sleeplessness. The car door opened, and a small figure came running out. "Mommy!" Rosie ran toward Blair as fast as 7-year-old legs could carry her. Blair dropped to her knees and caught her daughter in her arms, holding her so tightly it was almost hard to breathe. Tears spilled down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of every emotion that had been building inside her through those hellish hours. "Are you hurt? Did they do anything to you? Are you all right?" Blair asked in a rush, her shaking hands moving over her daughter, searching for any sign of injury. Rosie shook her head and buried her face in her mother's shoulder. "I'm okay, Mommy. Mr. Grant came to save me. He untied me and told me not to be afraid." Blair lifted her head and looked at the man who had brought Rosie home, one of Grant's men whose name she did not know. "Where is Mr. Ashford? I need to thank him." The man hesitated for a moment before answering in a low voice. "The boss was injured during the rescue. He is at Ashford Tower now. His doctor is with him." Blair felt her heart clench inside her chest. Injured. Grant had been hurt saving her daughter. She brought Rosie to Mrs. Jenkins, the kind neighbor who had been awakened in the middle of the night to help. Rosie, exhausted by everything she had been through, fell asleep almost at once in the older woman's arms. Blair kissed her daughter on the forehead one last time and then rushed out into the night, hurrying toward Ashford Tower as though her own life depended on it. When Blair stepped into the office on the 42nd floor, the sight before her made her stop short. Grant was lying on the wine-colored leather sofa, his suit jacket removed, his white shirt stained red with blood at his left side. A middle-aged man, presumably his personal physician, was bent over the wound, working with steady hands while gauze, bandages, and medical instruments lay scattered across the nearby table. The doctor looked up when he saw Blair. "The wound is not life-threatening, but he has lost a fair amount of blood. He needs several days of rest." Blair nodded and moved closer to the sofa, then sat down in the chair beside it. She looked at Grant. The man she had been certain only a few months earlier was responsible for her husband's death. Now he lay there pale from blood loss, after risking his life to save her daughter. Grant opened his eyes, his gray gaze unfocused and heavy, not entirely awake. He looked at Blair and needed a few seconds to recognize her. "Rosie," he whispered, his voice rough and faint. "Is she all right?" Blair felt her throat tighten painfully. "She's safe. She's asleep at the neighbor's house. It's all because of you." Grant gave the slightest nod, as though that was all he needed to hear. His gray eyes closed again, and his breathing grew more even as the pain medication began to take hold. Then he spoke again, his voice distant, as though he were speaking to someone who was not there, or perhaps to himself. "I didn't want her waiting alone in the dark. I didn't want her wondering if anyone would come, the way I waited." Blair sat there with her heart in a vice, and then she saw something that perhaps no one else in the world had ever witnessed. A single tear slipped from the corner of Grant Ashford's closed eye, traced its way down his cheek, and fell onto the cushion beneath him. Then another, and another, the first tears he had shed in more than 20 years. Blair sat there with tears running down her own face as well. She looked at the man lying before her and no longer saw the cold and powerful kingpin of the East Coast. She saw only an abandoned child, a child who had waited in the darkness for 24 years, a child who had never been held when he was sad. Slowly, Blair reached out and placed her hand over Grant's. His hand was cold, but beneath that cold skin she could feel the pulse in his veins, proof that under all that steel there still lived a human being of flesh and blood. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Grant's hand closed faintly around hers, an unconscious reflex in his half-drugged state, the way a child might reach for anything warm while lost in cold darkness. Blair did not pull her hand away. She sat there in the silent office, deep in the night, holding the hand of the man who had saved her daughter, and for the first time she understood that sometimes the people most in need of saving are the very ones who seem strongest of all. The next morning, Blair sat alone in the cafeteria on the 35th floor of Ashford Tower. The room was unusually quiet. Most of the employees had not yet come into the office on that Saturday, and only a few people working overtime moved back and forth in the hallway outside. In front of her lay a thick file, its pages containing the results of nearly 3 months of investigation, collection, and analysis. Blair turned through the pages one by one, her eyes moving over the numbers, the names, the transactions. Part of the file contained evidence against Marcus Webb and his laundering network. That section no longer held any value now. Marcus had been arrested the night before, and federal authorities had been anonymously informed of his location, along with enough evidence to prosecute him. He would face justice. He would pay for Jason's death, and for every other crime he had committed. But it was the rest of the file that had kept Blair awake all night. In the course of investigating Marcus, she had also accidentally uncovered other activities within Ashford Holdings, transactions that were not entirely legal, and that Grant Ashford himself had overseen. It was not money laundering like Marcus's operation, but it was serious enough that it would certainly attract the attention of law enforcement if it were exposed. Blair could take all of it to the police. She could become a key witness in a major investigation. She could watch Grant Ashford placed in handcuffs and taken into court. That would be justice in the strict legal sense. It would be the morally correct action, the thing any decent citizen ought to do. But it would also be betrayal. Betrayal of the man who had risked his life to save her daughter. The man who had been stabbed while protecting a child he had no obligation to care about. The man who had cried in the night, the first tears in more than 20 years, because he couldn't bear the thought of a 7-year-old little girl waiting alone in the dark the way he once had. Blair closed her eyes, and Grant's voice rose again in her memory, distant and aching, just as it had sounded the night before. I did not want her waiting alone in the dark. She remembered his face when he had spoken those words, pale from blood loss, his gray eyes shut. She remembered the tears slipping from the corners of those closed eyes, tears that perhaps no one else in the world had ever been allowed to see. She remembered the way his hand had tightened around hers in his haze of pain, like a child reaching for something warm in the middle of darkness. Grant Ashford was not a good man. She knew that. He had done many wrong things. He had built his empire on foundations that were far from clean. But the night before, she had seen something else in him. A possibility. A faint glimmer of light in the middle of all that darkness. The possibility of change. The possibility of becoming better. The possibility of redemption. Blair opened her eyes and looked down at the file on the table. Then she rose, gathered the papers into her hands, and walked to the corner of the room where the shredder stood. She stood there for a long time, holding the file, staring at the narrow mouth of the machine. This was her choice. No one was forcing her. No one was ordering her. There was only her and her own conscience. Blair fed the first page into the shredder. The machine whirred, and the page vanished into thin strips that fell into the bin below. Then the second page. Then the third. One page at a time, one piece of evidence at a time, disappearing forever. She was not forgiving. She was not forgetting. Jason was still dead, and that pain would stay with her for the rest of her life. But she was choosing to believe. To believe in the possibility that people could change. To believe that the abandoned child inside Grant Ashford could still be healed. To believe that sometimes justice is not only punishment, but also the decision to give someone a second chance. The phone in Blair's jacket pocket began to vibrate. She pulled it out and saw a message from Penny Marsh. I just heard Marcus Webb was arrested. At last Jason can rest in peace. Thank you, Blair. Thank you for not giving up. Blair smiled, a soft smile filled with deep relief. She typed her reply slowly, her fingers moving with care across the screen. Thank you for helping me, Penny, for giving me the pieces I needed. Jason would have been proud of you. She set the phone down and turned back to the file, now growing thinner and thinner. Page by page, it disappeared into the shredder, transformed into meaningless strips that could never be recovered. When the final sheet was gone, Blair stood there for a long time, looking at the machine. She had made her choice. It was not an easy choice. It was not a perfect choice, but it was the choice she knew she could live with. She chose for Rosie a life not burdened by hatred and revenge. She chose to believe that people could change, and she chose to keep moving forward, leaving the past behind her and turning toward the future that she and her daughter deserved. Blair stepped into the office on the 42nd floor that same afternoon. Grant was awake now and able to sit up, leaning back against the sofa with pillows propped behind him. His face was still pale from the blood loss, but his gray eyes were clear and alert again. The doctor had already gone, leaving only the two of them in the vast room with its glass wall overlooking Atlantic City, bathed in the late afternoon light. Blair sat down in the chair across from him and looked directly into his eyes. I destroyed everything. All the evidence. All the documents. You are safe. Grant looked at her, and for the first time his gray eyes did not hide their surprise. Why? You could have sent me to prison. You could have taken everything from me. Blair was silent for a moment, as though searching for the right way to give shape to what she meant. Because you saved my daughter. Because you risked your life for a child you had no obligation to protect. She paused, and her voice lowered. And because last night I saw you cry. I believe that was not an act. Grant said nothing. He only looked at her with that unreadable gaze. Blair went on. I don't want money. I don't want shares, power, or anything else you might be able to give me. There is only one thing. What do you want? Every year, Ashford Holdings will set aside a portion of its profits for a charitable foundation. That foundation will support the families of victims of workplace accidents. The people who lose the one holding their family together because of accidents on the job. Widows and orphaned children like Rosie and me. Blair held his gaze. That foundation will bear Jason's name. The Jason Kingston Foundation. Grant nodded without hesitation. Done. I will have my attorney establish it next week. There is one more thing, Blair said. I am leaving the company. I came here to find the truth about my husband's death, and now I have found it. Marcus Webb will pay. Jason can rest in peace. My purpose here is over. She rose to her feet and smoothed the front of her suit jacket. I need to find my own path now, for Rosie and for me. Grant looked at her, and for a brief moment Blair saw something like genuine respect in those gray eyes. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, Mrs. Kingston. Blair smiled faintly, a smile no longer marked by the hatred or guardedness of those first days. She walked toward the door, but stopped when her hand reached the knob. Promise me one thing. Grant looked at her and waited. Blair turned back, her brown eyes meeting his gray ones. Promise me that you will try to become a better man. Not for me, not for Rosie, but for the 9-year-old boy inside you, the one who waited for someone to come save him for 24 years. You owe that little boy a better life. Grant did not answer, but when Blair looked into his eyes, she saw that something had changed. A small light, fragile as a candle in a storm, yet still there, still burning. Perhaps it was hope, perhaps it was a silent promise, perhaps it was only the beginning of a very long journey. Blair gave the faintest nod, then stepped through the door, leaving Grant Ashford alone with his thoughts and the fading afternoon light beyond the glass wall. 1 year later, Blair and Rosie's lives had changed completely. Blair opened a small legal consulting office in downtown Atlantic City, devoted to helping exploited workers, laborers with no voice, and families like the one she herself had once belonged to. The office was not large, only 2 small rooms and a part-time secretary, but it was her dream, the path she had chosen for herself. Mother and daughter moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, not far from the city center, yet far enough to escape the noise of the gambling capital. The apartment was small but neat, with cream-colored curtains, a soft fabric sofa, and a refrigerator that was always full of food. There was no more leaking trailer, no more nights spent worrying about rent, no more dinners made up of instant noodles alone. Smiles had returned to both their faces. Real smiles now, no longer strained or weary the way they once had been. The Jason Kingston Foundation had officially begun operating 6 months earlier. In its first half year alone, it had supported more than 300 families of workplace accident victims across the East Coast of the United States, paying school tuition for their children and helping widows and orphans with medical and living expenses. No one knew where the funding truly came from. They only knew that every quarter, a large sum of money was transferred into the Foundation's account through an intermediary charitable organization. Grant Ashford did not need anyone to know. He was not doing this to be praised or recognized. He did it because it was a promise, and Grant Ashford always kept his promises. Grant remained the most powerful kingpin on the East Coast. Ashford Holdings continued to operate, continued to profit, continued to inspire caution in every rival who crossed its path. But those who worked close to him began to notice small changes, so subtle that they were almost impossible to see unless one paid close attention. He no longer worked until midnight the way he once had. Sometimes he even left the office in the afternoon without explanation, something that had never happened before. On those afternoons, Grant drove to a small park near Street, Catherine Academy, the school Rosie now attended through an anonymous scholarship. He sat on a bench beneath the maple trees, far enough away that no one would recognize him, yet close enough to see the little curly-haired girl laughing and playing with her friends in the schoolyard. He never went to speak to her, never let Rosie know he was there. He only sat and watched, as though seeing her smile was enough. On Christmas Eve, Blair's small apartment glowed with light and the scent of freshly baked cookies. Rosie, now 8 years old, taller and brighter than before, sat at the table with a sheet of paper and a box of crayons. "Mommy, I want to send Mr. Grant a present," she said, her eyes lighting up. "I drew him a picture." Blair looked at her daughter, and her heart tightened with emotion. She sat down beside Rosie and looked at the drawing the child had been working on for an entire week. 3 people stood beneath a brilliant yellow sun. The woman in the middle had pure white wings like an angel. That was Blair as seen through her daughter's eyes. Beside her was a little girl with curly hair holding a red balloon. Rosie had drawn herself. And the third figure, a tall man in a black suit, had a face colored over again and again until the crayon wax had built up thick on the page, as though the child had poured all her care into that one person alone. In the right corner of the paper was a carefully written line in the unsteady handwriting of an 8-year-old child. "Uncle Grant no longer stands in the darkness." Blair held her daughter and felt tears gathering in her eyes. "I will send it to him," she whispered. That same night, on the 42nd floor of Ashford Tower, Grant sat alone in his office while the city lights shimmered through the glass wall like a miniature galaxy spread beneath the earth. An employee entered, placed a small envelope on his desk, then quietly withdrew. Grant opened the envelope and took out the sheet inside. It was the clumsy drawing of an 8-year-old child, with uneven crayon strokes and simple shapes. But Grant looked at it for a very long time, his gray eyes resting on every small detail. The man in the black suit was not standing apart in some distant corner of the page. He stood right beside the other two, his hand almost touching the hand of the angel-winged woman and the little girl with the balloon, as though he belonged inside the drawing, as though he belonged inside the family. And for the first time in many years, perhaps for the first time since he had been that 9-year-old boy sitting in the dark corner of a room, Grant Ashford smiled. Not the cold smile of a powerful kingpin, not the polite smile worn during negotiations. This was the smile of an abandoned child who had finally found the road back home. The office door opened softly. Walter Briggs stepped in, intending to report something, but stopped when he saw Grant sitting there with the drawing in his hand and a smile on his lips. Walter's face, carved as though from stone, showed no emotion, yet in his ashen eyes there flickered a trace of warmth, as though he understood, as though he too felt a quiet joy for the man he had followed through so many years. Walter said nothing. He merely gave a faint nod, then turned and slipped back out, closing the door behind him and leaving Grant alone with the drawing and the city lights. People say monsters cannot change, that once darkness swallows someone whole, it never lets go. But sometimes, all it takes is for one child to ask the right question. All it takes is one clumsy crayon drawing. All it takes is for someone to believe that inside the monster, there is still a child waiting to be saved. Grant Ashford did not become a good man. The world is not as perfect as a fairy tale. He remained a kingpin. He still ruled his empire. He still made his enemies tremble. But every day, he tried to be a little better. For one drawing, for one 8-year-old girl with wide brown eyes, for the 9-year-old child still living inside himself, the child who had waited too long in the dark. And perhaps that is all we are ever allowed to hope for. And what about you? Who was the person who drew you beneath the sunlight? Thank you all for staying with this story until the very last moment. If you felt moved, if this story touched your heart in any way, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share this video so that we can keep bringing you meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? After hearing it, what lesson did you take into your own life? Please leave a comment below. We would truly love to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.